Welcome to Creating a Family. Talk about foster, adoptive, and kinship care. I'm Dawn Davenport. I am the host of this show as well as the director of the nonprofit creatingafamily.org. Today, we're going to be talking about whether you should consider adopting a child of a different race or ethnicity. We'll be talking with Megan Nam Holtz. She is a licensed master social worker and a Korean adoptee. She has been involved in adoption advocacy, awareness, and support for over a decade. She created an award-winning documentary film, found in Korea, about birth search, country of origin travel, identity, and adoption. She has a private counseling practice specializing in adoption. Welcome, Nam, to Creating a Family. We're so glad to have you.
Thanks so much, John. I'm very happy to be here.
So I just want to start by saying we think in terms, and over broadly, I think, or over narrowly, really, of transracial adoption being white parents adopting children of color, either Black children, or it could be, and that's what we predominantly think of it, but it can also be white parents adopting Asian or Latinx kids, as well as Asian, Latinx, and Black families adopting white children. So it is a broader concept, I think, than we think about. But I do think that in the United States, the predominant is white families adopting. So I just wanted to acknowledge, because I don't want to exclude and make it seem as if that families of color don't also adopt transracially, because they do. But starting as a white parent, so if you are a white parent, are there different issues you need to consider depending on the race of the child you are considering adopting?
I think that's a great question. And overall, the short answer is yes, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are some overarching topics that everyone should be considering when adopting a child of another race. But as you zoom in to the specifics of a race, yes, there are differences to consider. Absolutely.
And sometimes we hear, less perhaps now than in the past, but we'll hear families, when they're considering adopting, they'll say, well, I would prefer to adopt, if I'm going to do transracial adoption, I would prefer to adopt a biracial child rather than a child who is all Black or all Latinx. And that's an interesting thing, and it worries me some. So what are some issues that they should consider if that's how they're feeling?
It worries me as well when I hear that. And I'd like to pull apart why they think adopting a biracial child would be maybe easier for them.
Mm-hmm. That's what we hear. Mm-hmm.
And I really wonder if they have done the research and understand the complexities of being a biracial person in this world today. And maybe they think that part of their identity as white would also relate to their identity as white parents. Maybe that's what they're reflecting. But I truly believe that it is even more complex to have a biracial person in the fold, because it is more identities that need to be realized and recognized.
But if one of the identities is white, let's assume it is a child that is Black and white, a biracial African American and white child. Would it? The theory is, from many parents are thinking, well, it would be, we can always bring the white. We're white, so we can bring that culture in. So it's that thinking. So what would you say to that?
I would say that experiencing the world as a biracial person is a liminal experience in itself. And there are less people that will understand that experience. And so it is even more difficult to find mentors and people who understand walking through the world as a biracial person than it is as maybe one single race. Mm-hmm. And I think that it is a big mistake to think that because you have a white identity, that will, and this is putting it bluntly, that will help that child see their white identity, because they aren't white. Mm-hmm. That's the reality, is they are not walking through the world as white.
They are biracial, and that is an identity in and to itself. And as you said, then if you're trying to help that child identify, you're helping to help them identify as biracial, and your options are, it's harder to find. Yeah,
absolutely.
I also worry a little that that parents think that, so if we adopt a biracial child, they're Korean light or they're black light or whatever. They're not really black. They're not really Korean, or they're not really Chinese or Hispanic. They're they're only a little bit. And I think that's one of my main concerns, is not understanding if this child's identity is going to be as a biracial person or as a black person or as a Korean person.
Right. And when we really pull apart the concept of Korean light or black light or anything light, we get into a little bit of racial bias,
Mm-hmm.
and we really start looking at why do we think that might be better,
Mm-hmm. Or easier. I think it's probably
easier.
easier is, or maybe the subconscious is better. That's a valid point.
Right.
Yeah.
And then it also, to me, points out the fact that there has not been a lot of racial work that has been done if you have that
Mm-hmm.
mindset.
Mm-hmm. And so if you are considering adopting a child of a different race, that's the work that needs to go in before. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Did you know that one of the resources Creating a Family provides is an interactive training support curriculum for foster, adoptive, and kinship families? This curriculum can be used for support groups. It can be used for training of adoptive, foster, or kinship families. It's a turnkey curriculum. We have a library of them. We have 23 currently, 23 topics. Each topic comes with a video, a facilitator guide, a handout, and additional resources. It also comes with a certificate of attendance if you need CE credit. It is a terrific resource. It is super easy to use. So if you have the need to train, or if you're running a support group, or if you belong to a support group, I would encourage you to check it out. Go to creatingafamily.org, and it is under our training tab. You know, you mentioned at the beginning when I asked about does it matter the race of the child, and you said there are some overarching issues which we're going to talk about, but you said but the specifics differ as to the race of the child. What are some of the specifics that you can consider? And there are obviously many different races, but let's say black, let's say, would you be comfortable saying Asian rather than breaking it down? Okay, so
Sure.
Asian and then Latinx. So what are some of the specific things that parents should consider depending on the race? And I will throw out depending on where they live.
Huge questions. And, it's also going to depend on that child.
Sure, yeah, exactly. And the temperament and the personality and everything else, right?
Absolutely. It's going to depend on that child. So you're going to be putting all these things together. I think you need to immerse yourself in that specific child's world. You need to understand what it will be like to walk through that child's life as that child. And so you would need to find a community, find mentors, find people that can be in that child's world that will be specific to that race, maybe culture, but provide mirrors and mentors for that child. So you're going to have to look, and you brought up, depending on where someone lives, you might have to move.
Mm-hmm.
You might have to move to provide the best environment.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a big one.
Sure.
I think it's a really big question if you're looking at specifics of Black kids. And what I've been hearing is, this is hard to say, but you need to have preparation to talk about dealing with law enforcement, the history specific to Blacks in America. And this is going to go with every single race. And you're going to have to dive into each specific history of Asians in America, Latinx in America. You're going to have to go specifically into those things. And you can't, when you start going in, you can't help but learn about other minority, quote unquote, minority, or global majority, whichever you want to call it.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it soon won't be the minority. So we be careful of that word.
Yes. I think that as you go down the path of learning about a specific race, you cannot help but learn about others, which is, I think, great.
Sure. For us and for our children.
Yes, absolutely. And like learning about the stereotypes, because you're going to need to learn how to handle microaggressions and be prepared for preparing the child to handle microaggressions. And they're all specific. They're all very specific.
And it seems like maybe the foundation of what you said was at the very beginning that depending on where you live, you're going to need help as a parent. You're going to need people of your child's race to teach you. And so you need to look at where you're at and your own comfort level of immersing yourself in that environment and in that culture to help you decide whether that's a good fit for you and your family to be the best parent for this child. That brings up an issue. Is there a difference between transracial and transcultural adoptions?
There absolutely is. And for a long time, the concept of transracial encompassed transcultural.
Yes.
I think there's been a great shift into differentiating that transracial and transcultural are things that people should be talking about in a different way. There are obviously some transcultural adoptions that can be same race.
I think that's people don't recognize that, but very, very often when you are adopting a same race child, the birth family will be coming from a different culture. And that can throw, especially with open adoptions, can really throw families for a loop.
It sure can. It sure can. So I think in recognizing that transracial adoptions are literally a different race child joining a different race family, and transcultural are you're coming from another country joining a different culture. And there are different considerations. There are language considerations. There are, traditions lost that you're not gonna know unless you do the research. There are different foods and sounds. It's more dramatic, I think, to add that layer. And so I think it's great that people are talking about the fact that transcultural and transracial adoptions are not the same.
So I guess our goal as parents primarily is to raise children that have healthy self-identity as well as racial identity. How do those two differ?
I think they're intertwined. Self-identity and racial identity. Self-identity is the whole gestalt, the whole person, the whole, including racial identity, which can be a leading factor in identity, for sure.
But it's not the only factor, right?
It's definitely not the only factor. And, allowing youth to express what they're most interested in discovering at that point in their lives is the goal, right? So sometimes they'll be very interested in looking at their race, and sometimes they will not be.
Yeah.
So leaving that door open and making sure that it's okay to talk about those things is the goal, I think.
Right. I have a friend who was dropping her daughter, who was adopted from China, off at a large university, and she made a point of driving by the Asian Society. It was a group that and she wanted her daughter to see it was there. And her daughter said, "Mom, that's not my only identity. That's one part, but that's not, I may want to join them, but I may not. I may want to join the LGBTQ community. I may want to join, there are so many things that I want to consider, but of course, as a typical 18-year-old felt her mother was shoving it down, and the mom understood it. She goes, yeah, I get it. That for me, I'm worrying about you, and I want to make sure that you are focusing on your racial identity. This is a great opportunity for you to do that. But I also appreciate that you have many identities that you are working on, and you get to prioritize. So, yeah.
Right. How do you walk that line between, giving them agency and being supportive and not shoving it down their throats? It's very hard.
As a parent, all I'm going to say is it is a fine line. And honestly, nobody does it. I always say I throw it out there. I throw the ball out there. It's their choice whether to catch. But I'm also aware that even by throwing it, that I'm making a statement to them. And I think that sometimes it is that they would rather I not, but I don't know how to indicate to them that I am totally open for the conversation without periodically throwing it out. So I throw it and they can let it drop,
A lot of the kids that I work with say they kind of roll their eyes when their parents throw that
Yes.
ball.
Oh,
They
yes.
do. But at the same time, I think deep down they're like comforted and grateful that it's there. Because if
I
it
hope so.
wasn't there, I feel like it would be more difficult
Yeah.
to even acknowledge it.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're like, well, if my adult figure in my life is not afraid to
Mm-hmm.
toss that ball,
Mm-hmm.
maybe it's not such a big, scary, terrible thing to talk about or think
Mm-hmm.
about.
Or they're not, I don't want them to think that we're not comfortable talking about it. And if you don't throw the ball, you're giving them the idea that this is a topic that mom and dad don't want to talk about or are uncomfortable to talk about.
Right.
And so if anything else, I figured, yes, and the rolled eyes, sometime they're going to get stuck that way. So
Yeah. And so maybe it's not a ball. Maybe it's like a balloon with a little helium in it and it stays lofted. And if they want, they can get it, just a little bit. So it's kind of just lofting there.
it's just hanging there and they can either choose to bat it away, but they can't bat it too far.
Right. I mean, but it's there and they know it's there and it's light
Mm-hmm.
and it's for them to do with what they want.
Yeah, I like that analogy. The Jockabing Family Foundation has supported us throughout the years, and one of the things they do is help us provide 12 free courses that are available to you. They are courses focused on parenting, adoptive, foster, and kinship kids. You can find them at bit.ly/JBF support, bit.ly/JBF support. They are free to you. They can, if you need continuing education credit, you can receive that from that. You get a certificate of completion. They're just terrific, and we thank the Jockabing Family Foundation for their support. So you alluded at the beginning a little bit, but let's talk about what does it take as a parent to raise a child, and a parent who doesn't share the race of their child. What does it take to raise a child to have a healthy racial identity, and with knowing that is a part of having a healthy self-identity? You mentioned that the things you mentioned at the beginning were finding mentors and finding a community for that child to be able to feel one with. So what are some other things that parents need to think about when they're considering adopting transracially?
Well, I think before any of that, before the decision is made, you need to ask yourself and investigate why are you, first of all, why are you adopting? And then why are you adopting a child of another race? Add that to the mix. You have to ask yourself that question and give yourself an answer and think about the fact that you are going to need to give that answer to your child at various ages. So considering that, wondering if you've done the research, have you listened to other transracial adoptees? Have you listened to the voices of other people's experiences? Have you investigated some of your fears? Really looking at your fears and being honest about them. Have you sought professional support and advice? And if you have not, if it's not available to you, how will you get it? These are big questions. Have you thought about, and I mentioned this before, have you thought about prepping to deal with microaggressions and boundaries?
Give an example of microaggressions. We have talked about it on this show, but give an example so that for
something
people,
that I
listeners.
get. Me personally, I'm an Asian female. Sometimes I get, oh, you speak English so well. That's an example of a microaggression. They may be very well intended, but it still is othering. Have you looked at your resources? Have you taken a good look at your circles, your concentric circles, your close people, your family, your friends, your neighbors, your community, the teachers that will be involved, the people, the helpers, the coaches? Have you thought about if those people are adoption aware, adoption informed? Have you thought about if they're specific to the race of your child? Have you thought about how comfortable you are with people, the race of the child you're going to adopt? These are big questions. These are, you have to investigate your own willingness to investigate your own humility and your own cultural unknown, and how willing are you to say, I don't know this? And how willing are you to say, I don't know this, and I need to figure out how to learn more about it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I just covered a lot of things.
No, that's perfect. And what are your options for, have you thought about what your options are for learning more about this? About
Exactly.
your child's culture?
Right. And those are, if we can set up all those things before, that all goes into providing a safe environment where your child will hopefully have the means to develop a full healthy identity and ask the questions and feel all the feelings, because you want to be able to let that whole thing unfold as that child is ready.
Mm-hmm. So before you consider adoption, you really need to think about whether you are the right family to adopt a child of this race, without
Absolutely.
judgment, perhaps, just saying, am I equipped?
Right. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And if not, really think about why am I wanting this if I am admitting that I'm not equipped? And what am I willing to do to make myself equipped? And the people around me and my maybe partner, or maybe not, or my family,
Mm-hmm.
will they be supports? Will they
Mm-hmm.
be with me on this?
I am so glad you raised family, because I think that, we jokingly say sometimes adoption is a family affair, but it really is, because when you adopt a transracial child, you adopt transracially a child of a different race, you're changing not just your family, because you need to acknowledge that you will no longer be a white family. You will be a family that is mixed race, because you have a child in your family that is not white. But it also is your extended family. And so I do think that's really important to give some thought to. So, how should prospective adoptive parents, or how can they, prepare their extended family members for the adoption of a child of a different race or culture?
It's such a great question and topic, and I think it gets overlooked so
Yes,
often.
I do too.
And there's so many resources. Start sharing some resources, have some
Hmm.
conversations, really get to understand their feelings on this topic, because you might hit some sticky stuff,
Yeah.
and it's great to work it out before you introduce a child into your family. It's better to do it before than during, and there might be some places that you feel that you need to shield your child. It gets really hard. And so sharing resources, making space and time for those conversations,
Hmm.
seeing how much you and your family can tolerate the uncomfortable places. It's a good gauge to kind of get in there and say, I admit this is going to be challenging.
Hmm.
So how prepared are you to be supportive? And that can be a gauge, and then you'll know, because it's very hard to have someone 100% on board when they don't even know what that means.
Yeah. Yeah, I do think that we as parents sometimes spend a lot of time preparing ourselves, and then we drop this on our parents or our siblings or our extended family, and we expect them to jump on board immediately, forgetting completely that we weren't on board completely at the beginning. We had to think through and say and learn and do some thinking. But that adds time. And a lot of times once we have decided, okay, we think this is a thing for us, we don't allow the grace to our extended family to have that time as well. And I think we don't talk about it enough.
It's a great point.
Mm-hmm.
It is, because we do look at it as a continuum. And so you started here and you've had all these months and years to prepare, and you're asking people to jump on board
Mm-hmm.
now that you've made this bigger decision.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, they're starting. They're just at their
Yes.
starting point.
Yes. And if you have somebody in your family that you know well and you are not sure that they're ever going to be fully on board, or they're going to have to change a lot, and you don't know whether they're going to be able to change, you have to be prepared to think. You use the word shield, and that's a good one. Your obligation once the child is here is to protect that child. That's what you're signing up for. And that can dramatically change your relationship with a person who you don't think is not treating your child fairly, or is making racist comments or whatever.
Right.
And it helps to think that through. I think another thing we think is that they'll come around. Well, and sometimes they do. Very often they do. But sometimes they don't. And you need to be prepared if you've got somebody in your family that you think, I really hope they come around, but I'm not sure. You need to think of how you're going to handle it if they don't.
It's a big question.
It is.
It can alter how you relate to those relatives.
Oh, it should alter how you relate to those relatives.
It should. And it will, in many times, the child gets removed from that situation, or that person, the relative, gets removed many times.
Yes.
And it's a big deal.
It is. And it helps to think about it ahead of time, because, I mean, you may look at your family and go, this is going to be different for them, but, they're going to be fine. But most of the time, in your heart that if there is someone who is going to really struggle with this, you can't necessarily assume, and you have to be prepared for what will I do if they are not able to be around my child in a way that is safe for my child's emotional development.
Exactly. And I think when we're talking about this subject, it's great that you're looking at the first circle, the family circle. But this concept extends into the community, into neighbors, into people who are going to be buzzing in and out of your world. Yeah.
And that's, in some ways, it's both harder, but it's also easier. It's easier because they're not in the tight circle, but it's harder because you have less control over that and removing yourself. I want to thank one of our partners, Vista Del Mar. They are a licensed nonprofit adoption agency with over 65 years of experience helping to create families. They offer home study only services, as well as full service infant adoption, international home studies, and post-adoption support. They also have a foster to adopt program. You can find them online at vistadelmar.org/adoption. You mentioned earlier about finding role models that racially mirror your child, or finding role models of your child's race. And how do you find those role models for your child? And how awkward can that be?
It can be very awkward.
Yep. Yes, it can.
It can be extremely awkward. And so you let your child lead, but also do the work yourself. So again, it's a similar concept as tossing that balloon and having them available. I worked with someone who is an Asian adoptee, and their family used to watch Pocahontas, and I can't remember the Chinese Disney movie. Mulan, that was it.
Yep.
Mulan. And they watched it with the family, and they confided that they hated watching those movies because it made them feel awkward and othered.
Interesting.
And so how do you fold in media that isn't going to make your child feel awkward and othered when you're trying to support them? It's really hard, but I think having the conversation with the child is the most important part. If that family had said, do you like watching this movie? Do you want to watch this movie? We don't have to watch it now. Maybe we've watched it. Maybe you want to watch it by yourself first. Maybe you want to see how that feels. Really listening to the comfortability level of that child, the interest level of that child, and talking about why you think it's important to have role models and things that represent them in their lives. And saying, I think this is important because blah, blah, blah. You want to be able to say why you think it's important. Like mom and dad, or mom have this person that they looked up to. And so we thought it might be nice to have this for you. And that's the reason why. So if the child understands the reasoning and the intent, it could be open up a huge conversation. And maybe they're not ready. Maybe they're not developmentally ready for that conversation. But I think really letting the child have a say in how much they want to grab on.
Yeah. And it's hard because sometimes and I've personally found that children's books were such an effective way of doing that, but not just reading those books to my transracially adopted children, but also reading them to the whole family, fairy tales and things like that from their birth cultures.
Yes.
What I thought was
That's a great one.
and then reading it to the whole family,
Right.
not just to that child, and then reading other fairy tales from other cultures, so that I was not necessarily othering.
That's a
that
great
child.
point.
Yeah.
That's great. So having it accessible to everyone in the circle, in the family circle, is great. And because, yes, we're not just doing this for you. We're doing it for everyone. We want everyone to have these role models because it's
Sure,
important.
exactly. Well, and also
Mhm.
because we are a family that has this race, we are a family of this race because we have a child in our family of this race. So maybe with the Mulan, maybe alternate between Frozen and Mulan and Pocahontas, so that you're not okay. We're all sitting down getting our cultural lesson here for Susie.
Right.
So yeah. So throw in a little Frozen if you can stand it. Finding racial models in your community is a challenge, or it can be a challenge. It can also not be a challenge if you're living in a community that has a large percentage of people of your child's race. Then it's not. But thinking in terms of if you're blessed to be able to, or in that situation, then looking for a pediatrician, looking for a dry cleaner, that type of, and seeking out if there's a teacher of that race in your child's school, asking to have your child placed in that person's class. Those are ideas. It's harder when you're not living in an environment. You have to work harder at that.
It is. And, my supervisor, Dr. Baden, always says, if you are in a racial void, you need to move to a place that's not.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a commitment. That's a huge life change. But if that's not one of the things you're able to do or prepared to do, maybe you need to reevaluate and ask yourself why you think it's okay to not have that in your community. And if you need to drive a little while to get there, think about how that makes that child feel. Think about, it's a really big deal and it's a really big commitment, but so is bringing a child into your family.
Mm-hmm.
And if we can't do that, so she always says, be prepared to move to a community that you can have that access.
Mm-hmm.
And I will add one thing that I usually say to people, if you're adopting transculturally, and this is really hardcore, but I say, learn the language of the child that you're adopting, of the culture, of the country of the child that you're adopting from. It's a big deal, but there's no way you can learn a language and not learn culture, learn things that are nuanced, and makes that transition that much less traumatic. It's a big thing to say, I know.
Mm-hmm. Well, for those of us who are language challenged, I struggle with English. So the thought of learning a different language, yeah, we learned I love you very much. We learned thank you. We learned those things, and we included those as a family. But I must say we did not learn don't even have that option as far as I took the lessons. However, it was interesting. With my child. Yeah.
And that's something that says something. I think I know it's very hardcore of me to say that, but
well, no, it's something to consider though. I hear you. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what does the research show us? I am such a research geek. I always love to take things past just the anecdotal, because there's been a fair amount of research on people who have been adopted transracially. What does some of the research show?
Well, some of the research that I'm aware of is that transracially adopted people fare better when their families fully acknowledge their race in domains of mental health and functionality, which is a very basic thing to think and look at. But it's we had this whole colorblind concept. We see no race. Love is enough. That's the best. But we realize that that's actually quite detrimental to the people of color that need them. They need their identities to be seen. So that's one piece of the research. Another sad piece of research is that adoptees are overrepresented in mental health and substance use facilities, even though we're only 2% of the population, still massively overrepresented. And they're 4 times more likely to commit suicide. And it is even more, the numbers are more intense and higher for transracially adopted people.
Interesting.
It's sobering.
It is sobering. It absolutely is sobering. We always say that friends let friends know about podcasts. I certainly know that is the case for me. I find out most of the podcasts that I listen to have been suggested by others, and that's how others will find out about this podcast. So do us a favor. Please let your friends, your family, anyone you come in contact know about the creatingafamily.org podcast. We want to continue to grow, to inspire and strengthen these families, and we can only do so if people are listening. So please let people know. We've talked about what to do if somebody in your family you don't think is going to be treating and the bottom line there is to be prepared to cut that person out if they're hurting your child, then you have to be willing and able to do that as well. What are some of the issues that come up with open adoptions when adopting across racial lines? Now, that can happen predominantly with domestic adoptions, but it can also happen some in international adoptions. But let's focus primarily on domestic adoptions.
Well, I was going to say that, with the international adoptions right away, the communication is an issue. So I'll just throw that out there. It's a huge
issue. Yeah, it's a huge issue, both for adoptees as well as adoptive families.
Exactly. And that brings me back to the language comment. But in domestic adoption, it is open adoptions the word is so broad, covering so many levels of openness. It's slightly deceptive. I think it's a slightly deceptive word, and the concept is great, but very rarely do we hear about successful open adoptions. And some of the reasons that I've seen and heard that they're challenging is because the agreements that people thought they could do, once they get into the life, they find they cannot for many reasons. And it can be distressing, extremely distressing, can be extremely emotional. And it needs to be handled with a lot of professional help and care, I think. And sometimes we can run into issues of racial differences. Sometimes we can run into classism issues. Sometimes we can run into, there are other children from family of origin that are still with birth family. Why me? Which is a really sticky one.
Sure. Why are they parenting my brother and are not parenting me?
Right. And that can create some really hard discussions that sometimes aren't handled.
I think that is one of the advantages, however, of an open adoption is because you have the answers. There is usually a reason why the parent is parenting a brother or a sister, a sibling, and not this child. And as opposed to not having contact with the birth family, you have the answer. There is usually a reason. It may not be an easy reason, but there's usually a reason. And when you're in closed adoptions, you're imagining the reason and making it up.
Absolutely.
But with open adoptions, I'm surprised. I would love to. That's an interesting comment you made at the beginning about there aren't a lot of successful open adoptions. I guess I see them. I see successful ones. And this goes back to the anecdotal part. Without a doubt, they can be difficult. And I think your point at the very beginning was such a good one, is that there is no really definition of what an open adoption is, and it can mean anything. Right. Anything, as long as it can just be, once a year sending a picture. But it can also be all the way up to having the birth parents babysit on Friday night. So it can be a whole lot of different things. And I think that's part of the problem when trying is it successful? It depends on what you're trying to achieve. And
it depends on who you're asking, is this successful?
Sure, absolutely.
Are you asking family of origin, is this successful open adoption? Are you asking adoptive parents? Are you asking the adoptee?
Yeah,
it can be a
that's right.
different answer from every
Sure.
single person. So that's
Yes.
hard to
Uh-huh.
say.
Yeah, and the answer probably differs a lot on timing.
Absolutely, it does.
The age of the child, and the where the birth parents are in their life. So yeah,
Yes, it can vary, it can change, and it does.
yeah. But since we're talking transracial and transcultural, I think it's important to acknowledge that race comes into play in open adoptions because these people are your child's parents,
Hmm.
first parents. You are also their parents, but you share a child. So that comes in, and the cultural and the classism.
There's some power dynamics that are very challenging.
Very challenging.
Hmm.
Very challenging. Yes. That's for
And so I
sure.
think it's going to take a lot of support to navigate that, and some working through feelings of humility and guilt as an adoptive parent, as an adoptee, confusion, identities, code switching comes up. I think it's a really challenging place to navigate. And again, it's going to be very individual for each family and family.
Hmm. Sure. Yeah, it absolutely will. I'm glad you raised the term code switching. We all do that. But transracial adoptees, I think, have to do it more.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk a little about that. And from a parent standpoint, understanding both what it is, but understanding the stresses that it can cause for their child.
Yes, yes. I think understanding that that is something that we all do is great, and that's some basic understanding of what kind of stressful situation that puts you in. I think being able to have conversations acknowledging the fact that this child will be looked at and seen differently when they are not with their adoptive family is a big concept.
Hmm. It's a huge concept. So, when are the typical times? It depends also on where you live as well, but when are
Yes.
the times? The one that comes to mind is, of course, going to college, but what are some of the other
Yeah.
times?
Yes, yes, absolutely. Going to college, going to camps, different various camps, going on specific trips, school trips in school. If you're changing schools, obviously college is a huge one, and it continues into adulthood with a new job, with a new move, a new
At
location.
that point in adulthood, you're not seen as part of your family, your adoptive family. So, how is it? Show me examples of when it comes up with your because you're not a part of your family at that point.
I'll just use myself as an example. There was a time that I had to move to another country to do a job, and I was shocked at the assumption that I was either Chinese or Korean. I had never occurred to me, when I open my mouth, I have an American accent. I speak English. But in another country, it was almost, I'll use the word devastating, to recognize that my when you see me, I am an Asian female.
Exactly. Hmm.
And I had experienced glimmers of it obviously before in my life, but I think it was just such a ground shaking recognition, being already in foreign ground, but still not having any tether to any specific family member or any friends in this situation. It was, I think that is an example of something that I was not prepared for. And I don't think anyone in my circles knew to prepare me. And
Hmm.
so it was just something I had to go through, figure out, learn. And the ironic part is that I was in a job for an Asian performance with all other Asian people. So it was doubly impactful because I felt like, you have the imposter syndrome
I
that
was
comes
just going
out.
to say, yeah. Tell me, you felt like I'm not a real Asian. I'm not a real Korean.
Yeah.
I'm not. Yeah.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Absolutely. And so you're dealing with this, and I'm speaking from my perspective because I don't want to talk for anyone else. You're dealing with this identity issue with, wow, I'm recognizing that I'm perceived and seen as this, but yet I know I feel different.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
feel I feel comfortable in this situation and in this situation and this situation. And I don't think that people recognize that I don't feel comfortable in this situation with all
Mm-hmm.
these other Asian people.
Mm-hmm.
And it is a really nuanced conversation to have. And again, I don't know how to prepare people for that, but the concept of understanding when you go somewhere without us as a family, you are going to be seen with this race.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And that's something as parents we have to realize is that, and a lot of parents will say, people don't, they just see her as, in your case, your parents might say, or your parent might say, she's just a Holtz, or she's just a Smith
Mm-hmm.
or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And that's true to a certain extent because we do tend to, as parents, we run in the same relatively small circles. We see the same people. The school gets to know us, and they get to know that we have kids, and they see a Asian child or a Hispanic child, and they go, "Oh, that's probably a Smith. That's probably one of the Smith kids." And your church is, so our children are seen as part of us.
Yeah.
But as they grow, your comment of a camp is a good one. So the child goes to camp, and the other kids in the camp have not seen the parents drop them off. So the parents come at pickup time and run up and are hugging the child, and it's like, who are these white people hugging you? I mean, why are they
Uh-huh.
hugging you? And
Uh-huh.
that your child is aware of that. And when you go to college and you have a picture of your family, and why do you have that white people? Why do you have those white people on your bulletin board?
Absolutely.
So then you have to think as an adoptee, well, do I want to put a picture of my family up there and invite or am I being disloyal
Right.
to not do that? But do I really want to draw the attention that
Right.
have to explain? So, yeah.
There's another really quick story that I'll share is that, I was meeting my sister somewhere at a workplace, and I have a white sister, and she was like, just tell them you're my sister. And I said, Amy, they're not going to believe me. And she was like,
Yeah.
oh, yeah. Like it just doesn't register sometimes. So
Yes.
having that registration, like
Yes.
making sure everyone is on the same page
Yeah.
and recognizing that that's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And so the adopted person doesn't always have to remind, like, well, actually, no, they're not going to believe me that I'm your sister.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. And I will also say for the other children in your family, when they come to that realization, we experience that as a family, that one of our older kids, somebody questioned one of the younger ones and it just really upset them because this was their sister, and they adored the sister, and it was, and it really, really upset them that somebody would question the connected. Yeah. And yeah. So it's preparing the whole family.
The whole family, yeah.
But it's not an accident that or I think parents need to consciously realize that, especially when their children leave home, that they need to prepare. And it's a hard thing to prepare, because it's a nuanced thing.
It is.
I mean, what do you say to your child? You're going to be seen as an Asian female. Duh, is what your child will say back to you.
You know what? It might be worth exploring. How do you feel when people see us as a family?
Mm-hmm.
Then and go from there, because, some people experience extreme discomfort going out to a restaurant.
Uh-huh.
And feel like the waiter's staring at them. Why are you there, kid?
Yeah.
People have that experience a lot. People sometimes when they go on vacation and they're not around people who know their family already.
Exactly.
Stuff like that. So
when you change the circle you run in, then you will get stares. It's the idea. You're a conspicuous family.
Exactly. So maybe start investigating that dynamic will make the child more aware that that's how the family is perceived. And that's one concept of understanding identity with the family, which is important in understanding the concept of the dynamic without the family.
Mm-hmm. And for those people considering adoption, transracial adoption, the realization that no matter what you think, you will become you will become a family that stands out. You will become a family that when you walk into a restaurant, people will notice you and they will stare. And what is your comfort level there?
Yes.
And how are you? I mean, there's not a whole lot of things you can do to handle it, but you need to be aware of how do you feel? How do the other people in your family, if you have other children living in your family, how are they going to feel about becoming the center of attention?
Yeah.
Because you will.
Yep. It's a huge thing to acknowledge
Hmm.
beforehand. That's a huge thing to think about beforehand. And that's kind of what I was thinking about with preparation in terms of boundaries, because you will get questions, you will get scares, you will get inappropriate questions and comments.
Hmm.
And so preparing yourself to say something in the face of those comments and questions is important because you will be taken off guard.
Hmm.
And so that prep also aligns you with being able to be an ally to your entire family.
Hmm. I'm so glad you said that. At Creating a Family, we do have resources to help families prepare. But since we're primarily talking about people at the considering stage,
Mm-hmm.
you need to know that that's part of the preparation because, as you said, Nan, very well, you will get inappropriate questions. And the funny thing is that it's often they're not in fact, in my experience, almost always, they're not ill intended.
Right.
But the audience that you really are looking at is the child, assuming that
Right.
their child is there. And so you need to prep for how you're going to handle the question in a way that is affirming to the child, not for
Yes.
the person who's asking the question, because quite frankly, you don't owe any obligation to them,
Right.
but to your child, you do. So,
You do.
and all of this goes into making the decision: are you the right family? Are you willing to not get angry when somebody asks an inappropriate question, unless it's terribly inappropriate and you feel like that's the correct response.
Mm-hmm.
But are you a person who rather likes the being in the center and likes the idea that people are looking at me and making good judgments about me because I'm a person who adopted transracially, and that says something positive in my mind about myself? But what if a child who's already in your family doesn't like being the center of attention? What's that going to do to that child? And what's it going to do? And what if the child you adopt really doesn't like that? And so, how are you going to handle that?
Huge questions.
Hmm.
And again, I love how you're saying you're focusing in on the child because each child is going to be different.
Sure. Some may relish it and just,
Some may think it's fine.
makes
Some
them
may think,
special. Yeah.
right. Some
Hmm.
may feel, and it also may change at different
Yes.
stages.
Uh huh.
So being age specific sensitive, being stage specific sensitive, being child specific sensitive is so important in all of these
Hmm.
conversations.
Hmm.
There is no one right answer.
There isn't. That's because there's no one. We are not generic as humans.
No.
But realizing that at the beginning, but when you're considering adopting transracially, I think it's so important. We can't give you the specific answers, but we can tell you that all these things are things that you need to consider. And if you're partnered, you and your
Mhm.
partner need to consider.
Yes.
And yeah, I think all that's so very important. Well, thank you so much, Megan Non-Holtz, for being with us today to talk about this. I think it's an important topic at the beginning, before we spend so much time talking to people after they have adopted. But I think it's so important to talk with folks when they're considering it.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.